Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Detra Price-Dennis, and I have the privilege and the pleasure to moderate this incredible panel this afternoon. I want to say before I begin that I am in, I believe, hour 19 of a 24-hour allergy medication. And for those of you with allergy problems, you will know what's happening right now. So I want to apologize for any congestion and scratchiness in my voice. But I have a little baby bottle of rosé, so I think life will be fine once I leave here. And I'll be able to then enjoy my allergy medication. But at any rate, thank you all for being here today. Before we hear from our distinguished panelists, I'd like to share the structure of today's panel with you. One pivotal question that we want to address on the panel today is, what have you learned from your research that can inform teacher preparation? And specifically, how should teacher preparation be changed for the 21st century? So what will happen is each panelist has received a question ahead of time. I will read the question and allow the panelists about 10 minutes or so to talk about their ideas and share their thinking, and then we'll go down the road that way. And then we will come back together and have a conversation around recommendations or changes that we think make sense for the 21st century. After that, I will open up the floor for Q&A. And hopefully we'll engage in a lively conversation with some really thought-provoking questions and information that we can take back to our day jobs. All right. Thabo, I believe you are going to start us off. I will read the question so that the audience is aware of what we've asked you to think about for us and share with us today. This question is pretty windy as I was reading it. So you may actually need more than 10 minutes. But you are known for your ideas about transgressive education, urging teachers to incorporate narratives, politics, and issues that affect students' lives into their teaching. How do we do that in classrooms where kids come from a range of backgrounds, when we're balancing the perspectives of race, culture, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, nationality, immigration status? Or to put it differently, how does your work your work seems to speak to the central question of civics education. How do we get people of very different perspectives, opinions, experiences to agree on not what is right, but on the principle of holding an open discussion? And how does the teacher keep his or her own biases or views from intruding?
So, I must admit that when I saw the question, I sort of battled because it's got multiple layers that one has to engage with. But first, let me just say, given the sort of the broad question that we're trying to address in this panel, which is around sort of utilization of research into practice, right? How do we make sure that the research that we do actually leads to some sort of practice in the classroom or in the educational environment that we're working in? The first project that I did as a researcher was around looking at the experiences of LGBTI or queer youth in South African township schools. And the aim was to sort of understand what are the various experiences that these young people have in the schools, but also to understand who are the main role players in sort of the negative homophobia that is experienced in those schools. And one of the things that came through quite clearly was that teachers were heavily implicated in the practice of homophobia in the schools. They were, in fact, the ones that were driving young people out of the classroom, that, in fact, some young people were associated or allocated to specific individuals within the school as, you know, if you've got Mark, that's your child, Mr. Francis, you deal with Mark only. If Mark comes to the staff room, I will not touch Mark because I don't engage with gay people. There was a narrative, right? We had instances where teachers would kick gay kids out of the classroom because, well, you know, they shouldn't be there. I'm a Christian and I should not be dealing with gay kids. So that triggered a question in me as to, well, if we're finding this to be a problem, what should we be doing to assist teachers to be able to handle their own biases in the context of a classroom? So bell hooks came in as a wonderful solution to this around transgressive teaching. And at the heart of transgressive teaching is an understanding that teaching, the practice of teaching, is a political enterprise, that it is never a neutral exercise, that in fact we go into spaces to teach and we get read almost immediately from the perspective of the students who are sitting down there. And also, as yourself, as a teacher, you are also in the process reading the students that are sitting there. We carry our identities all the time. And currently, the design of education assumes a teacher who is very neutral, who comes in only possessing knowledge and who deposits this knowledge into kids who have an empty mind. And in essence, that is actually a flawed understanding of schooling. Because, of course, learners and students come into a learning space having had particular experiences, and those experiences shape the way in which they receive their education. It also shapes the way in which they engage with each other. So, in fact, what we see through transgressive teaching is the need to center politics as a way of achieving a full education. How does that happen? It's actually a way, as a teacher, in fact, I loved Lou's earlier presentation this morning, which interrogated the whole concept of power. Because as teachers, we have tremendous amount of power. We assume to have the authority by virtue of having the content knowledge that we present into the classroom. Yet, of course, learners who come into the space also have various forms of knowledges that they have accumulated over time. Jonathan Jansen speaks about the notion of bitter knowledge, which is that knowledge that you learn from one generation to the next about the other. So he asks us, in the context of South Africa, we experience apartheid, an apartheid history, where we have children that were born after 1994, and yet these very young people who should not have any recollection of apartheid whatsoever are the ones who are fully involved in being racist, in actually engaging in racist exercises. There was a point in which 4 young white men, students at the University of the Free State, got black workers to drink urine that they poured into bottles, and they saw this as an Olympic exercise. And he was asking, how does this happen? How do people who have never had experiences of apartheid exhibit a culture of racism or perform racist forms of engagement? And his response is that from generation to generation, people pass on what is called bitter knowledge, which is this knowledge that we learn from our parents, from our churches, from our institutions, from our culture about who the other is. And because of this bitter knowledge, when you come into the classroom space, you are carrying this bitter knowledge with you. You don't leave it outside the classroom, right? Your identity as a teacher and, in fact, as a student, it is highly implicated in the process of learning. So part then of being transgressive is understanding that your power as a teacher is not there, that in fact power is shared equally with your students. You get to a point of vulnerability where you actually allow your students to learn whilst you also learn from your students. So it's a shared engagement, a relinquishing of power, a position of vulnerability where you can narrate your own experiences, your own life, and also allow young people, young learners that are with you in the classroom to also tell their own stories from their own perspectives and then have a conversation. Because only when we are able to speak across borders are we able to have meaningful conversations. And meaningful conversations means having dialogues with people, not having one narrative that you try and dictate to your students, but rather having an opportunity for the knowledge that you carry to be disrupted in a constructive manner. I'm going to pause there.
Kenny, we'll move to you next. Your experience is in technology and data, fields that many people do not always think of as having a social justice slant, though they do. In your work, what are the central social justice questions related to technology? Are they about equal access to technology, or using technology to detect information patterns that reveal inequities in the system, or both? And how do we equate aspiring school teachers and leaders with these issues in a way that they can apply in their classroom or their schools?
Yeah, so it's, as a resident techie on this panel probably, it's clear that technology has infiltrated everyday life and every aspect of our life. And in fact, technology has really become a core component of schooling. Schools generally spend about $5 billion on technology. And that is growing every year. We also have like bits of research that show that students are more engaged in technology, and even when it comes to thinking about some of the longstanding equity issues that schools face when it comes to equal access and educational opportunity, technology is really framed as kind of the great equalizer, right? You can put technology in and everyone has equal access. But I kind of work from the assumption that we're working off a false kind of portrayal of technology in schools that we need to kind of take a step back a little bit. In the literature, they really call it a rhetoric-reality gap, right? So there's all of this spewing out of technology's doing all of these things, but how connected is it to the reality of everyday schools? One question that I had, it was funny because when I asked my advisor and other people this, they kind of looked at me and said, now that's a dissertation topic. I said, well, you know, if we have all this technology in schools, why are African American and Hispanic students still performing the worst on every educational measure if it's supposed to be the great equalizer? Right. And so, you know, I kept searching through the literature, and there was lots of fantastic research about sort of the lived experiences of teachers in the classrooms, and they were talking about how they use technology to engage. But I wanted to know, I wonder if I can use some large-scale data to take a step back and tear down this kind of assumption we have to build it back up again. And I think in my dissertation research, I was able to do that. Is able to take a step back and really think about, okay, if we're approaching technology from a social justice standpoint, to what extent is technology truly improving schools, and for whom, and under what conditions? And so I really have two micro questions and then a macro level question that I'm asking. The first is, like, to what extent can we use kind of nationally generalizable data and statewide data to understand the types of teachers and leaders and how they use technologies in schools? We focus so much on how and why, but I argue, what if we start maybe trying to typify teachers? Like, we generally have, you know, I know that when we're talking with others, we have types of friends that we hang out with, we categorize them, right? Or we have types of teachers that we love that have certain characteristics. Well, that's the approach that I take. Are there different types of teachers who use technology? And I found that there are 4 different types from a nationally generalizable standpoint. Some of them use technology in meaningful ways, and some of them don't. But the core thing that I found, which is really interesting, was that the types of teachers who use technology in less meaningful ways are in our poorer schools. Social justice question. Then I went and said, okay, well, let me look at the school and districts. Now, unfortunately, we don't collect that data from a nationally generalizable standpoint, so I went to the next best thing, Texas. Texas is huge, right? There's over 9,000 schools. My SPSS data file is humongous. Over 9,000 schools, about 900 districts, and so I asked the same question, but from a leadership standpoint. Does technology leadership, so those who are in the district level and in schools, are they leading for technology in the same way, or in good and meaningful ways? And I found again, yes, they are. But not in poor schools, at the school level, and at the district level, African American and districts with higher proportions of African American and Hispanic students their districts do not use technology in meaningful ways. Another social justice question. So again, coming from the standpoint of data, how is it that we can leverage the data we have to give us a deeper, more meaningful understanding of technology use in schools? And that leads to my macro level question, which is really about how we can get school leaders and teachers to understand data in a way that they can create technology interventions that specifically meet the needs of our historically minoritized communities. There are many, many different approaches to this. Yes, it is about access. I know that for a fact because a nationally generalizable study says that there are still schools that don't have access to technology. They also don't have teachers that have access to the skills and knowledge to use technology. But there's this third kind of level that I think that's not really talked about. is how technology espouses certain social values and assumptions that kind of counteract our efforts to implement technology. I'll give you an example. For example, if you're in a classroom and your principal says, I'm gonna put smart boards in every single classroom, what does that mean? Well, if a teacher sees that, the smart board goes in the front of the classroom, and typically it's teacher-centered, right? They're the ones that are pressing the buttons. But we know from the research literature that that really lecture is not really the most meaningful way to use technology in a classroom. But if a principal puts a smartboard in there, again, that technology itself espouses certain values that tells teachers that they should be using technology in a certain way, right? And so in our poorer schools, smartboards are the easiest things to get. They're recyclable, right? You can take some down. People donate smartboards all the time. And so, again, in thinking about this whole idea of data and technology, I come from the standpoint that schools are full of data, but sometimes starving for information, right? And that with technology, it's easy to attempt to buy equity, right? I'm gonna buy technology and put it in the classroom, and that's gonna solve all our problems. When inherently we need to start talking about deeper issues, in which I espouse is this idea of technology leadership for social justice, that we start with the idea of what is it that my school needs and the culture that I am serving. What is the technology that's going to allow me to connect to those students? And so as I move up the scale and thinking about, okay, I need to now get access to the technology. I now need to support my teachers in instructional leadership for making sure they know how to use it in meaningful ways. And then I can start talking about technology, digital citizenship, those important values that students need in order to be successful. And again, a lot of times we start with the stuff. Right? We start with the stuff thinking that that is a reform that's going to change everything. But again, just looking at what we see just in New York and just in general, and from a national generalizable standpoint, we have a lot of work to do. And so that's sort of where my work sits. And I'm happy to say that, you know, I was a little afraid going forward because the technology industry is such a powerful industry with lots of money. And my study is not popular. It will not be popular. But the way that you think about it is, now I believe that our teachers and our principals have a more informed way of thinking about technology use in schools that goes beyond just, oh, technology is good, it helps us, it prepares them for 21st century learning, which I still don't really know what it is, versus, you know, what traditional learning looks like. So that's really where my work comes from, and that's sort of how I'm tearing it back down to build it back up.
Thank you. All right, so many ideas from both of you for us to think about during the Q&A. So keep those in mind if you have questions. We'll definitely have time for those. We're going to move on to Etta. Etta, you are known for your opposition to homework as a waste of creative energy and an impediment to learning. Yet, so much of how teachers are prepared has to do with the types of assignments that they give. What does a non-homework-oriented teacher preparation program look like? And are there exceptions to your objections about homework?
Let's see. I'm going to try to take one question at a time.
Absolutely.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the issue of homework, because I think it is a deeply political issue, even though we don't think about it. It's so, in some ways, invisible in the world of education. We assume that homework is part of good pedagogical practice. And so I think we really tried to open the topic of homework up to examination and to questioning. And you think your work is not popular?
Right.
Imagine trying to get a paper on the evils of homework in the AERA.
Oh, yeah.
It never happened really for years. But anyway, so I think that you know, when my book came out in 2000, there was a lot of discussion around that book and around the issues of homework, and it sort of comes in and out of fashion. And right now, I think we're getting into a point where people are beginning to question it again. But I think that the issue for us is that and I'm not sure about the term bitter knowledge, but it's such an assumption that we have that it's very hard to question it. And so even in the schools and with the teachers that I work with, who are in Title I school districts and who know, the teachers know the kids don't have the resources at home to do the homework. It's really a very profound equity issue in this country about technology. I mean, so my students understand that their students aren't going to be able to complete homework, but we can't really talk about that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
silent,
Yeah.
like, okay, we'll pretend you're going to give homework, or, so I think there's that silencing around a topic that is as ubiquitous as homework. Interestingly, in 2011, the Los Angeles Unified School District came up with a new homework policy for the district, which said that only 20% of a student's grade could be based on their homework completion. And I want you to tell me who opposed that new homework policy? Who did? The teachers. The teachers in LAUSD went nuts. And I understand why they did, and I think primarily because I think people in policy worlds don't typically understand how teachers work. So if I'm a teacher and I've got my whole curriculum laid out and homework is part of that curriculum, if my district says, now you really can't give as much homework, that district should then provide teachers with summer professional development so they can actually redesign their lesson plans and the way they deliver curriculum and the way that they mark students. So we don't ever really think about those kind of profound policy changes in terms of what we need to provide teachers with the resources to make those changes. So I think that has been a really huge issue for districts that have tried to do something with their homework policy. In terms of my teacher prep program, there is a deep belief system that is attached to the way we do schooling. So my students come in, they're graduate students, so they did well in school. I mean, you're not in graduate school if you didn't do fairly well. And they have all these assumptions about what it means to teach, what a classroom looks like, and what they should expect their students to do. And to dislodge those beliefs is really, really difficult because they're beliefs. They're not really based on, for example, research, because if we look at the research on homework, we know that it is there is not a shred of evidence that homework increases academic achievement at the elementary level. So that's sort of a non-starter at the elementary level. At the secondary and middle school level, the research is very inconclusive, and that the research shows that, for example, that kids that do more homework get better grades. And there's a lot of people who are questioning homework that say, well, that one issue is teachers who teach AP classes and honors classes assign more homework, so those kids may do more homework, and that homework is part of what we would call a good student model. So if I'm a good student, I come home and I sit down and do 2 or 3 hours of homework. And the ability to actually establish any kind of causal relationship between homework and academic achievement, you guys are all students, you can't establish causality in social science research, even though we try to make those claims. So there's all of these questions about whether or not homework is a driver of academic achievement. And if you set those questions aside, which we haven't been able to answer for over 50 years, and look at homework from a different perspective, from a more equity perspective, and the impact on kids and what kids have to give up in order to do homework. Homework looks like a very different situation. And I don't think that it's sort of possible to say that, okay, we're going to train teachers to not give homework, but then they're going to go into schools where they have homework policies. Right. So there's this, I think, this really difficult issue in teacher education, which is I may know this about homework because I've been researching it for a long time, but the schools that my students go into are more kind of party line, like you're talking about, right? There's a party line about homework. So and I think it's probably a problem in other areas of teacher preparation, but we might prepare our students for what we know about learning theory or about classroom practice or about pedagogical content knowledge, but the schools don't necessarily know that. And a school principal is much more concerned with the perception of their schools among parents, for example. So if schools try to move on homework, there's always a lot of parents that say, what's wrong with you, that you don't give my child homework? So it's really a set of cultural assumptions that we have to deal with when it comes to homework. And the problem then of teacher preparation without homework is that teacher preparation programs don't really exist in a vacuum. You know, we exist in this social cultural world where there's assumptions about homework. So I don't know if it's possible let me rephrase that. I don't know what the role of teacher preparation programs should be in changing school practice, because school practice is set in a lot of different ways. And I'm in Arizona now. We have a very conservative state legislature. We have a very conservative state superintendent of education who was in my community a while ago, and she was on a listening tour, as state superintendents of education like to do. And Arizona is a English-only state. For those of you that don't know, we don't allow bilingual education in Arizona. So I asked her what she felt as the superintendent for the state, what she felt her role was in terms of helping the people of Arizona who vote on these kinds of things, what her role was in educating the public about the research, in this case about bilingual education. And she said the most amazing thing to me, which I still am not sure I understand what she was getting at, although I have my assumptions. She said, my job as the state superintendent of education is to do what the people of Arizona want me to do. And the people of Arizona voted against bilingual education, so therefore that's what we're going to do. And I asked her, I said, well, all of the research says that bilingual education is the way that we can best serve the needs of these kids. And she sort of hid behind this, the voter speaks. And to me, that's really one of the sort of central issues that we face today, is that those of us who are educators, those of us who are in leadership positions, what is our role for helping the people, in the case of homework, the parents, in the case of bilingual education, the voters, what is our role in helping people understand educational research and what it implies for practice? And I think that, I love TC, but graduate schools of education have never really, John Dewey and George Counts aside, but have never really taken their role as sort of public intellectuals and seen themselves as people who need to help people understand educational research. So there's this role that education scholars have never really played in this country, and it's a very different role to be a public intellectual and to write for the New York Times or Time Magazine than for a scholarly journal, which as a faculty member, that's how you get promoted. So there's this disconnect in my mind between the assumptions of the academy and what we're rewarded for, and the role that teacher educators or that educators need to play in the larger public space of helping people understand what we're learning about education from the research that people are doing. So I think there's a lot of moving parts in the picture when it comes to what can research tell us, and then who's gonna report that research. So, all right, I'm gonna leave it there.
So each of you brought up so many incredible themes, and obviously equity, advocacy, public engaged scholarship, really getting information out there, were central to all of the things that you talked about in general. I'm wondering if you have comments or other thoughts that you want to share around your question that you may not have shared the first time around, if you want to go back through that. Or, so I'll start there. Are there comments or questions that you want to share with each other, or to return to the original question? Anyone?
Well, I want to talk about the technology piece, because it was actually one of my doctoral questions here. But anyway, so I work on the Arizona-Mexico border, Title I schools, where the clocks don't work. Now, I want you to understand what it's like to be in a classroom that has 3 clocks, and they all 3 have different times on it. So where I am, clocks represent a technology challenge. And I think this issue that you brought up about the equity issue with technology, it's like the conversation is over here, and the reality where I am is over here. And I think that in terms of technology, that's a huge problem for poverty districts. And so I'm glad you're talking about it, and I think we need to talk more about the digital divide, because I think it's huge.
Yes. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of rhetoric around the digital divide is over, right, because of cell phones.
Right,
Cell
exactly.
phones, there seems to be this bridge. But I really have 2 answers to that, too, is that a lot of times schools ban cell phone use, first of all, right? So, that goes out the window.
Yeah.
And then 2, I think actually technology overuse is becoming a interesting digital divide piece as well, because when students can't use the devices that they are used to, or they're using computers that are in the lab to do drill and practice because they have to study for a test, because that school is either under the district wants overwatching them, and they need to improve their scores. There's this push that they're putting in the classroom to use technology and so it's this interesting dynamic that even in, I would say, historically underserved communities where they don't have access to the tools, when they go home, and you brought up an interesting fact about homework. If their homework is online,
Right, exactly.
or they have to do research online in order to find, because they don't have textbooks, that complicates the issue. And so again, I fundamentally believe that, just pushing technology, or like I was saying it before, like this idea of just buying equity and just putting tools in the classroom, it doesn't meet the fundamental problem.
Yeah, and I would say that in my work as well, what I notice is that a lot of times people will say, oh, we use technology, and usually what that looks like in practice is perhaps someone having a laptop or a desktop and a Google form that they've created for kids to fill out. And I think we have to have a fundamental conversation in teacher preparation about what do we mean by using technology, and are we continuing to position students as consumers, which you all have talked about in different ways, or are they producers of information? Are they able to analyze multiple streams of data? Are they able to make sense of things? Are they able to take that information and create content that can be shared with other people? Or are they simply positioned as doing a worksheet on a computer? And both of those things get talked about in the same conversation, and they are very different, right? So I think that that's another thing we have to also think about.
I also think that our technology leaders in our schools need to take courses in transgressive education and culture responsive education. Because again, starting with equity and the idea that all education is political, like you said, is an important fact.
Yeah, I was going to say, linking to what you're talking about, at the heart of, in fact, all the conversations that we've had today, is this idea of knowing our students. And in fact, transgressive teaching is in essence about that. Who is the student that we're trying to service? I mean, if for instance, we're offering technology and we're expecting teachers to be engaged in technology, and our students don't even have the tools, the resources. I mean, and again, equally homework. I mean, in South Africa, we have we talk about technology, and that it's available. So there's this class divide, and also it's racialized and classed at the same time. So, and equally in the same way, homework is racialized and classed at the same time, because the availability of textbooks, for instance, you'll have a textbook, if you are in a privileged school. If I'm in a very disadvantaged context, access to a textbook that allows me to go and do homework is not there. So, we have to be able to work from a space where we understand who it is that we're dealing with. Who are the students that we're working with?
When I was in Zimbabwe, I was beginning this work on homework. And so I talked a lot to my Zimbabwe students about homework in Zimbabwe. And I found out it was gendered in Zimbabwe because the boys would go home and they would have the opportunity to do homework before it got dark because they didn't have electricity. But the girls went home and they had to get the wood, they had to get the water, they had to cut the onions, they had to cook. And so that gender issue in Zimbabwe around homework was huge.
Exactly.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I thought you had another question. Well, then one final question I'll pose to the panel before we open up for questions from the audience is, based on everything we've talked about and your own, research and work, what recommendations do you have for teacher preparation? Do you have a few that you could share today?
Jeez. Okay. I'm a very controversial person, so I think the type of work that I do sort of sets me for controversy. But I think at the center of everything is that we need to understand that identity matters, right? We cannot, as an education system, work from a basis that everything is equal and that we are servicing students and a population that is equal in every way. So the identities of people who occupy our education spaces have to be recognized and acknowledged. And, we talk about pedagogies of presence, that a person has to go into a space where they feel acknowledged, accepted, included, and welcomed. And if teacher education programs fail to do that, in fact, they are failing to assist and support students for the next generation, I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'd say that I completely agree with you about knowing our students. And I think some of the most interesting work that's been done at the University of Arizona is around the issue of funds of knowledge and how do you understand as a teacher what your students are bringing into the classroom in terms of their own knowledge base. And I think we're beginning to understand that in teacher ed, that we need to really help our students know who their students are going to be. But I think that's a really hard slog for people because you have to be able to step back and to open yourself up to the reality of your students' lives, which for my students, when they see the lives of their students, it's a little bit difficult for them. And so I don't know how you hit that part of it, to help them understand the difficulty that a lot of their students have to deal with. If anybody has an answer to that, I would be happy to hear it.
I think in teacher preparation, and particularly with my research, I'm interested in leadership preparation as well. There's usually like one technology course that teachers usually take, and it's usually very tool focused. And they usually give the phrase, technology's just a tool. But in my research, I found that it's not just a tool. It has a lot of, again, social values and assumptions that are associated with it. And to come from an angle of cultural responsiveness, even in a technology course in which we think that this is an inanimate object, is extremely, extremely important for both teachers and leaders to understand. And so talking about those ethical and social issues in a educational technology course for teacher and leader preparation is, I think, the next step in truly preparing our leaders to face kind of the growing inequities when it comes to technology.
I would agree, and I think if I had to add anything that is also very unpopular, it would be that there's such a divide between theory and practice in so many teacher education programs, and it's unfortunate. There are ways that we can really do something about it, but it means faculty actually have to engage with communities by sometimes teaching their courses in those communities. So whether it's teaching your courses in a school or a community space, faculty need to figure out ways to broach the divide by actually putting themselves in the spaces with their students and really facilitating and helping scaffold all of these ideas we've talked about. It's one thing to sit here in the university and have these conversations. It's quite another thing to watch your professor interact with the group of sixth graders and then debrief what they just saw and then get a chance to do it yourself the next week with the same group of sixth graders. And as much as I push, I don't think that that is going to be the norm here at Teachers College, but if there are other people who think that should be the norm, I suggest that you join me in pushing to get our teacher education faculty to really consider the benefits of what that looks like, not only for our relationships with communities and schools, but also preparing people to work with students in real context.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think something happened in Arizona this January that is, that should be of concern to everyone who's a teacher educator, and that is that the state legislature changed the teacher certification regulations in Arizona, and now a superintendent can hire anyone they want for a teaching position, and the school district applies for the certification for that person. No training necessary.
Wow.
I did want everyone to know about this because I think it's really important. But anyway, so now if anybody can, and there's a little question about whether or not you even have to have a college degree, but I'm going to leave that aside. But so now superintendents can get teacher certified, no preparation necessary, and if they do okay for 4 years, they get a permanent teaching certificate in Arizona. Close your mouth.
Wow.
So that raises the question of what is going to be the role of universities in teacher preparation.
Right.
And I think the future of teacher preparation in universities is not at all secured.
No.
And I think the point that you make is the crucial point. If teacher preparation programs historically have been rooted in communities and schools so that we were seen as a part of this process, we would be in a very different position than we're in now, which is that teacher preparation were cash cows for universities. And so the researchers who do research might teach the ed tech class, but God knows they've never been taught in a classroom.
No,
So,
right.
I mean, we have a history of
Yeah.
how this field has developed.
Yeah.
And in Arizona, we're now facing the future of, to me, our field.
Yeah.
And it's a little scary from the point of view of Arizona.
No, absolutely. And the consequences are also when states have reciprocity, that person can move from Arizona
Right, exactly.
to New York with
Right.
the same teaching
Watch
license,
out.
right? So like, that's a very good point.
I know.
A quick comment. Part of the problem is, of course, that Arizona started the year with 2,000 empty classrooms, right? So it's a question of who do you put in there? But that's not really my question. My question is I work, for example, with all at-risk kids. And one of the concerns that I've had for years is that grading systems are so screwed up. A kid is smart and doing well, knows his math, knows the subject, but because he didn't do his homework, because he's a pain in the ass, he ends up getting a D, and the parent says, well, you didn't know your math. Instead of giving the parent a very clear understanding of what the kid knows by saying, he knows math, however, he's irresponsible in terms of doing what I've asked him to do, and he's a pain in the ass, which you need to take care of at home. The message to the parent is that this kid is not a good math student. For the kid who's an at-risk kid, the likelihood is that grades are not an incentive for them. When I was superintendent of Lexington, Massachusetts, everybody wanted to be 4 points, 1, 5, 6, 3, 2, or whatever it would be, some grade. These kids are just want to get by, right? And so what's happening at the elementary schools, a lot of these kids have just been passed by just to get by, never really learning the subject instead of getting the mastery. So the question I have for you is there any chance that teacher preparation universities will go to the point where they say, let's look at grading of kids about whether it takes them 6 months or a year or 2 years to master a subject? Do we let them have them master the subject and then let them have mastery versus giving them a D or an F or a C and having the kid not learn the subject but passed on to the next grade with a gap that's even bigger. So the time he gets to high school, and in Arizona, we got about a 17% or 18% dropout rate every year and increasing. But colleges don't do anything, the university, including this one, doesn't do anything to look at how do we break that cycle, partly because the way we grade and the way we pass kids on. So I'm wondering, what's the solution to that kind of a problem?
Can I just say that part of the problem is the accountability regimes that we've actually set up in schools. Assessment in schools is a form of accountability where the state can actually monitor what the teacher does. And in fact, it's no longer about the understanding of where the child is in relation to their own understanding of the content that is presented. So even the design, the conception or the notion of assessment itself, I think is problematic. And I think I agree with you wholeheartedly that in fact what should be happening, in essence, for me, as far as I'm concerned when it comes to assessment, we should not be focused so much on these various tasks and then deciding that, you know, we're going to test this and test that and then the child is ready, but rather looking at the comprehension, the mastery of and the development of the child in his or her entirety within the course that is offered.
I'd also argue that I know that in the grades research, grades really indicate how well a student is at school, rather than this idea of mastery per se, right? So or learning, right? Because grades assessment, particularly with grades, are typically one track, right? If you know, I would say I'm a person that does well in school because I know the game. Right? I know how to sit in my class. I know how to take notes so that I can pass the multiple choice test. I know I can get up and present. And so that begs, I think, that gives credence to the notion that we were all saying about the cultural responsiveness, right? So if your students don't respond to you standing in front of the classroom and simply talking at them, well, that could be one reason why they're not getting good grades, is because they just don't respond well to how you're teaching. So in terms of thinking about putting teacher preparation programs, as Detra said, in communities, it's super important for you to understand the cultural and social context in which you're teaching and adjust your teaching based on that, rather than just simply saying, I have to assess because I have to give grades. And really focus on learning that is culturally responsive and not just necessarily indicating that you can do well in a traditional schooling model, right? So that's sort of the way I approach that whole question in terms of
I
grades.
just got a quick follow-up. What I'm saying though is the kids do know the work, right? But when they get sent that home, when it's got a D or an F because of all these other factors that have been put into place, the parents are angry at the kid. The kid's basically given up because he can do the math, but all these other factors that are put into it are the problem. So it's not a matter of bad teaching. It's a matter of how we've assimilated all this data and put it together for this grade at the end.
I think sometimes it's also about moving away from I don't want to say just traditional, but moving away from forms of communication with families about how their students are performing that tend to send a signal of failure or achievement. So I think redefining achievement in some ways is also necessary. So when I was doing my student teaching way back when, I had the privilege of working with an incredible literacy professor who focused a lot on assessment, not evaluation, but assessment. And he made us spend a lot of time talking about what everyone here has talked about so far, is how do you know your student? Who is this child as a learner? What do they do when they're stuck? What do they do when they're doing really well? How do you know when a child has mastered a concept? What is it that they do how do they show you that they understand something? How can you communicate that with parents through a grade? How can you communicate that to parents in an anecdotal note? How can you show an artifact from the student's learning that communicates that? So, I mean, I know it's kind of old school, but I think portfolio assessments were so rich because you could truly show what a student had learn, also areas that they still need growth in, by really looking at a more holistic picture of who that child is. And so what we were encouraged to do until No Child Left Behind was try to create that picture through a report card, try to create that picture by offering snapshots of their portfolio alongside a narrative, alongside grades, so that parents could say, well, maybe Johnny has a D, but she said that he keeps getting stuck and he just throws his pencil. Or, like there's all these other anecdotes that go along with that D. There's images of his work to sort of give a complete picture. Now, of course, that requires more work on the teacher, right? Because someone has to assemble all of that information. But I think I did that for 8 years, and I would do it again today if I went back in the classroom, because I really did know my kids. I knew who they were, I knew where they were stuck, and what's most importantly, they knew it. They knew who they were as learners, and they knew when they were stuck, and they knew what to do about it. So it wasn't so much about the grade that I gave them as how they saw themselves as learners, and us coming to an understanding of that grade or that particular anecdote or that particular artifact represented one point in their learning, not who they are overall, but one particular point. And I think if we can have some conversations, whether it's in teacher prep or at the school district level, about how to get back to some of that sort of thinking from the 90s, I think we can talk a little bit more holistically about kids than we're doing right now.
Can I just add to that? Because when I was in Finland looking at the teacher prep program, I was stunned by a number of things, but in relation to the assessment, I was stunned by the fact that starting in kindergarten, that parent-teacher conferences are led by students.
Yes.
And the
that too.
students have to reflect on their learning in every subject area,
Yeah.
and they're the ones that lead the conversation about what they've learned.
Yeah.
So when I would sit with student teachers, and they would have a lesson, and their master teacher would say, well, how do you think that went? They were so incredibly reflective of what happened in the classroom and their own learning from that experience, because they started being reflective as learners when they were in kindergarten.
Yeah.
So there's ways to build that in. I don't think we're going to do it anytime soon, but there are ways to do that.
No, absolutely. And officially, we are open, the floor is open for questions. I think there's one mic, it's up in the front, but we'll pass that around as people need it. Thank you. Yes.
I had a two-part question about preparing teachers. I thought the morning was incredibly interesting and empowering and hopeful, but I am concerned about the fact that we have an appallingly ignorant president who's horribly racist and bigoted, making public statements that reinforce the worst kinds of racial stereotypes. So then we've got kids like in the border schools, or I'm sure some of this is in Africa. So how do teachers then teach in an environment where there's this constant bombardment? If you're facing a multiracial, multicultural group, or I happen to be living in the Midwest now where there's no diversity. So how do teachers teach in that environment? So that's sort of my first question. And my second question is this idiot Betsy DeVos. What does the community do about somebody like that, who's in such an influential position, has no credentials, and is trying to promote these policies that are gutting our public schools?
Thank you.
You go this time.
No, I'm not going. But I do wonder how teachers deal with the president's language, because every classroom I'm in, there's a list of rules, and the first thing on the list is no swearing, and then you have a president, and then the kids come into school, and I was in a school one day after something he said, and the kids would come in and say, well, why can't I say shit? Why can't I say shit because the president says it? And the teacher didn't really have an answer to that question. And I do think that is a profoundly important question for teachers now. What do we say to the kids when we have this kind of president?
Yeah. Geez.
You don't have to deal with this.
I think, part of offering what I would call a full education is having honest conversations that understand that schools are a reflection of the society in which they're located. And part of that is, and I know that this is controversial to say, but teachers don't have to be in agreement with the state.
Yeah.
And part of being a teacher is to be an activist in the classroom. And so I see my responsibility as a teacher as being an activist. And if it means speaking directly to the ills of society, you do that. And you know, if you look at if you study carefully what happened during apartheid, you know, we had these laws that were quite clear. You cannot do this. And the state would go and proclaim and say, this is what's going to happen. How the narrative changed was through disruption in the classroom. So the teachers would go in and deliberately disrupt the narrative. And so the power that we have around disruption can, in fact, cause the change or result in the change that we want. And so if Trump is going out there and saying and articulating all of these things, yeah, well, I think my responsibility as a teacher is to bring back my kids to an ethical, much more full education in the classroom. And part of that means being an activist, I think.
Yeah.
You know.
So there are lessons from apartheid that we should be thinking about here? I mean, in terms of the environment, this toxic environment.
It is very, yeah. So one of the things that the two things, right? Earlier on, I think James was in a panel here and spoke about the philosophy of Ubuntu, understanding that I am because we are, and so that is a powerful way of understanding humanity. That in fact, you know, a person can go out there and say that all Mexicans are rapists, but in fact, in reality, that's not true. He's dehumanizing the Mexicans, and so understanding that we need each other for us to survive. We can't have an America-only policy because America needs others to survive. And so if you think about how apartheid was fought, it was along a communal strategy. So we need each other as a community to come together and address the social ills and across the racial divide. So across the gender divide, across the sexual divide. So it's an intersectional approach to dealing with issues. Yeah?
I'd also add that like technology can be a very powerful tool for civic disobedience, I would say. I think the Parkland students are a perfect example of that. Whereas our president might have Twitter fingers, right? Our students also have those same Twitter fingers as well. And so this is sort of the approach, again, in terms of teacher preparation, rather than just simply saying, okay, we're using technology to learn math problems, right? Situating it in civic responsibility. How can I use technology to amplify my voice and to identify fake news, for example? I was in a classroom with a teacher, and I don't know, at the State of the Union addresses, you know how you see like the audience is going up and down? Well, that teacher, she was a U.S. history teacher. She wanted to use that as a mechanism to get students to think about over time how rhetoric has shifted on certain issues, particularly around immigration, around gender issues. And it was a powerful moment where it's not just they're reading about a president on an iPad in a textbook. Right, they're utilizing technology in a way that has an ethical slant and a really meaningful, powerful way to engage students on teaching them how to be responsible consumers of data and using technology in a way that they can engage in those important conversations where we need to have political dissonance and we need to fight against some of this rhetoric that's going on. So that's another one of my passions in teacher education, is trying to get teachers to see parts in their curriculum where technology can push them past where they're comfortable in going when it comes to those controversial issues.
And I would also add that, well, two things, along with being an activist, really helping our pre-service teachers understand that their role should be to be advocates for their students, and that means that they, along with being activists, advocating along, even if they feel like, well, I can't speak back in certain particular ways, your job is to advocate for the needs of your children. And so being able to really help them understand what that can look like in practice. And then also, along with the activism, being politically active. A lot of what's happening in teacher education and what has happened in education has happened because we have been silent.
Exactly.
We have not engaged our policymakers. And we have a responsibility to do that. And I think modeling that as a teacher educator is very important, but then also engaging our policymakers with our pre-service teachers so that they understand what that looks like is important. And it doesn't have to just be people in Congress. It could be your local school board. It could be your city council. I mean, there's lots of ways to get involved, but I think really having those conversations early and frequently. It can't just be one class in one time. It really needs to be frequent and early in their career where they can really think about themselves as having those roles beyond just doing the curriculum in the classroom. Another question in the back.
We see this in a lot of professions, where in science, for instance, we're being hit with the fact that the scientist is quiet, and the word is not getting out about how to collect evidence and how to make inferences and publicize it. And in the scientific community, there's April 22nd Earth Day, everybody's going to be vocal, but a halfway point, taking the example from the scientists, of what you're suggesting, instead, the teachers are so busy in the classroom, it's hard to ask them to do one more thing of communicating with the public. But empowering journalists and empowering other people that are, instead of going one-to-one with the doubting public in science, it's the parents who don't believe in vaccines, and in education and something else. So we want to go to the people who have big voices, and talk to them, and let them use their expertise to teach our message.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. Another question here?
Hi, yes. My question is in regards to the homework. What would be sort of an alternative to homework? And is there a way to also incorporate technology in that aspect as well? Thank you.
Well, I'm on the far left on the homework thing, and I think that, kids go to school 7 o'clock in the morning, if they're lucky, their school doesn't start till 9, but 7:30. And in high school, they can be there 12 hours a day. And so in some ways, I think it's a child labor issue, that if you are in school 8 hours a day, why do you need to do more work than that? I mean, and I understand that people now work 24/7 and email has changed the whole work world and all of that. But I think there's fundamentally this issue of child labor. And I think 8 hours is enough for school. And then the issue of your own interests. If you are a kid and you're in school 8 hours a day, and then you've got 2 hours of homework or 3 hours of homework. I talked to a woman today whose middle school kid had 4 hours a night. Where do you become your full self? I mean, kids are more than numeracy and literacy people. They're budding scientists, they're spiritual beings, they're cousins, they're grandchildren. All of those parts of a child get eclipsed because of the homework. And it's not just, okay, we're going to cut it back. At some point, you need to shut it off. You need to be able to say, I'm done with school now, and now I'm going to go give my dog a bath. It's a fine thing to do after school, but I don't think there's room really for the state, and let's not forget that the school is an organ of the state, for the state to tell parents and children what they should do in their homes. I think it's anyway, so I think there should be a boundary. So I'm not a fan of any homework because I want kids to be able to do what they want to do after school, to develop their own interests, so when they apply to college, they have something to write about in their college essay.
And I'd say with technology, I'm also on the far left. I actually, so I currently work as a technology coordinator in a school in New York City. And I just had a parent meeting literally yesterday about parents who said, my kid is addicted to their technology. They can't get off of it. And you start hearing it, and you ask them, you're like, well, just tell them to put it away. Well, they have 4 hours of homework, and they have to get their homework online. They're using Google Classroom. They have to read their math problems because the teacher's trying to be sustainable. So all of their homework is online, and yet they're not going to sleep because the blue light that emits from your technology keeps you up, right? So again, my role is I'm the same way. Like, when you're at home, let's be in the moment. And I actually have to tell parents, take the technology out of the bedroom,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
right? And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
take it out and put a designated space where everybody's phone goes. You have designated time to talk to one another. You have designated time to connect as a family without the phone.
Yeah.
And if your student has to do their homework, there's something called printing it out, right? They're on Google Classroom, all the teachers put out, you can print it out. No one's telling you that you have to use technology. So I'm fighting against technology as the default.
Right.
When we enter a classroom, why is it that as soon as kids get in, they just take out their phones, they take out their laptops? Let's be in the moment first. And when a teacher prompts you to take it out, then we can use it. And so that's sort of where I'm at as well. It's like, it's a huge distraction, and we really need to think about balance and how our students are growing up in a world where, again, technology is the default, and it's causing a lot of issues, not only psychologically or emotionally, but also physically, when they're hunched over, they have, they're carpal tunnel and all types of things. You need to be mindful of the impact that it can have on our body and our mind and spirit.
The question
To your point, I'm sorry. I remember in high school, in math, we would do our regular math problems without a calculator, without a regular basic or even a scientific calculator. And then, once we figured out how to use it with our hands and pens and working it out, then we would be asked and told to bring out our calculators to show an alternative way to solve the problem. But yeah, just to answer your point.
Thank you. We have a question in the back, and then we'll move to the front and over to the side.
Thank you. Hi.
I think that might be it.
I'm a classroom teacher for 15 years, and I'm also a student here, finishing my dissertation soon. I want to ask a question about the homework issue. I also push back on homework. I don't give vacation homework. I don't give weekend homework. So I try to cut back, but then you have parents.
Yeah, I hear you.
And say, my child doesn't have homework. Why are you not giving my child homework? Because they have this understanding that homework is supposed to be part of their educational experience. And when I tell them, I really give homework when I'm going to use the work, not just make copies of the, whatever, and just have kids do packages and we know a lot of teachers don't check that. But they're not going to.
No, you're right. You're right. That's true. That's true.
They hardly check, they just do,
Yeah.
put a smaller face. They're not really checking the content of the work. So it's really not beneficial to, but if I'm giving homework, I give homework based on what I'm going to teach next or what we have learned, and so you build on that. But I'm also in the Title I school, and we have this equity issue, and, so I try to cut back as much as possible. Another part in terms of teacher preparation, we come here at TC, and we have professors giving us homework.
Okay, Kenny.
I was in one class, I'm not going to say the professor's name, and she talked to us about, social justice, equity, and showed us a video about kids not wanting to do the work. So one of my classmates said, okay, so I'm going to opt out doing the last presentation. And then quickly she said, if you opt out, it's going to affect your grade. So it was just not balanced. You can't tell us to be this socially conscious and then you yourself as the professor right in the classroom did not practice that.
Well, let me just answer that, because I get that from my graduate students all the time. Well, we're doing the no homework lady. Oh, how come I'm getting homework? And I say to my graduate students, if they spent 12 hours a day in school, the way high school kids do, they would finish their graduate program in 3 months. So
Yeah.
college students and graduate students do not focus for 12 hours a day unless they're writing their dissertation. That happens. But I mean, so college and graduate school, I think, are fundamentally different because of the amount of time that kids are expected to be at school. But I have to answer that question.
So I do have a pushback to that.
Okay.
Obviously, since when you get to graduate school or college, you have to learn how to manage your time with, okay, you go to class, lecture for 2 hours, then you spend it, because I did science, you spend like 5 hours doing what the 2-hour lecture did. So how do we, because high school is supposed to be a prep environment to help them to manage for college. If we're not teaching them how to do after-school work, how would they be able to be successful in college?
Well, I don't think we learn time management by having someone else manage our time. I think that people learn time management by actually having chunks of time where they say, okay, now I've got 4 hours, I need to do this. I think time management is something kids need to learn, profoundly important for college, but they learn it by having their own time to manage, not by doing the work of the school. So I think time management is really important, but they got to be free to mess up with their time management.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, although I will say, if you have a question for a panelist after and they have a few minutes, I'm certainly sure that they will spend a couple minutes talking with you individually, but I do want to honor everyone's time and our stock, so we'll do one more question and then we will conclude.
I want to comment on what Etta Kralovec was talking about. If I was told that I see homework at its best as an application of what was taught in the classroom. So if I was advised that I could not assign homework, then I would, I hope, revamp my lesson plan so there would be some opportunity to apply
Right.
what I had taught in school so that the kids would go home seeing some relevance and some competency in mastering what you've done. The other thing is, if I'm changing direction, as far as the parents are concerned, then I would assume that a PTA lesson or sending some sort of communication home with their students, you could explain why you're seemingly to shift directions, and aren't you doing am I not doing my job because I'm not engaging the kids to do something? I might also, so I would explain what I'm trying to do and maybe suggest a book they could read or a magazine article that sums up what I'm doing, because the more we can engage the parents in the enterprise, the happier we're all going to be.
Yeah.
We like for the parents and the teachers to be working together for the good of the child. That's why we're here. So it's a challenge, but it seems to be a challenge that we might embrace happily.
Thank you so much.
Let's thank the panel for their time.